My name is Rachel Schnur. I'm a third-year history PhD student up at Princeton, and really thinking through ways to do history research in community. So just thank you so much to Suzanne for everybody involved for asking me to help chair this next session. I'm also a former teacher. For 8 years, I taught U.S. history in classrooms in Oklahoma and Michigan and had Indigenous students. And the hard questions that they asked me really what I have long considered to be the beginning of my journey into doing U.S. history research. And so for that reason, I'm just so excited to hear what's coming up in this panel. We're going to be talking a lot about continuing our conversation in the direction of curriculum. So we have 6 people, but 4 kind of groups that are going to be speaking in the next session. First, we have Rachel, Talbert, Natacha, Robert, and Nancy Tavarez-Correa from the Teachers College at Columbia University. And then after that, we have Claire Garland from the Sandhill and Navesink communities. After that, Karelle Hall from the Nanticoke Indian Tribe and Rutgers University. And finally, Mccallum from the Munsee-Delaware Nation and the University of Toronto. And our session, as I'm sure you have seen already, is called Representing Lunaapeewak in School Curricula. So without further ado,
Rachel for that introduction. I'll introduce myself, and then as we go through slides, I'll let Natacha and Nancy introduce themselves. My name is Rachel, and I'm a settler in Lunaapeewak, and I currently am a lecturer and research fellow at Teachers College, Columbia University. And I came into this work a long time ago because I was working with Indigenous high schoolers through an organization called USET, United South and Eastern Tribes, that works with tribal nations from Maine all the way down to Texas, and doing tribal action initiatives with them. I did that work for 2 decades, and one of the big tribal initiatives all the high schoolers always had was, no one talks about us in social studies class, and when they do, it's like we're dead. And after listening to that for 20 years, although I do believe that high school students are agentic and powerful, I was like, somebody needs to be doing this research. So my dissertation research was on the civic identity of Native American students, but specifically in public school spaces in cities. Because most of the students I worked with and USET nations were all in school spaces like New York City or Newark or Miami, Florida, where they were in public schools and dealing with that level of erasure. So that's how I come to this work. And we got invited to do curriculum development by some members of the Lenape in New York and New Jersey. And why curriculum development? Well, because a lot of really smart people have done great research on civics and history standards across all 50 states in the District of Columbia in both 2015 and 2021. And we know that 80% of the content involved in teaching Native peoples all takes place before 1900. So I always tell teachers coming to this work and people who are working with teachers that if their teachers aren't teaching Native presence, it's because they were never taught Native presence. And so now they don't know how to teach Native presence. In addition to that, all of the civics and government content taught in all those 50 states in the District of Columbia erases tribal sovereignty effectively. Again, because teachers were never taught that. The course I teach at TC is on teaching for Indigenous curriculum and survivance, and we try to push against that narrative. And we support teacher unsettling in service of Lenape futurity and Indigenous futurity more broadly. In New York, there are no questions about the Lenape on the Regents test. I'm not a huge Regents test supporter, but a lot of teachers say, well, if it's not on the Regents test, I'm not gonna test it. So it's not there. And then in the 4th grade, there is a standard on the Lenape in New York City, and it is that you make a Lenape house. You spend about 55 minutes on that lesson. And if you were a teacher who was adhering to New York standards and you did that in 4th grade, you would be doing your job. And there's a lot of teachers who do more than that, but that's really not good enough. In New Jersey in the 4th grade, there are also standards about learning about the historic lives of the Lenape, nothing about the present. And on the New Jersey graduation test, which has not been given in a little while, but might be coming back. And again, not a fan of standardized tests, but there are also no questions about the Lenape. So not a lot of reasons for teachers who are strictly adhering to standards to adhere to this. We know that curriculum is political, that it's powerful, and that all these trends are settler futurity trends and Indigenous erasure. So when we were asked to collaborate with the Lenape on curriculum in these spaces in New York and in New Jersey, we did so acknowledging this present futurity on the curricular project of replacement, which aims to banish Indigenous peoples and replace them with settlers who see themselves as rightful claimants to the land. And that is frankly what happens in most public schools right now. It's a settler futurity creating environment. So we've been working with the Public History Project out of Rutgers University in New Jersey, obviously our institution, Teachers College, and Ramapo Lenape on this work. This is our third year of doing this work together. It's hard to believe that, but we've put together a pre-K through 12 curriculum. And one of the big things that we frame in this curriculum is the idea of survivance. So Gerald Weisner has written a great deal on Indigenous survivance, and we've decided to bring it into public school spaces. And survivance is the idea of an active sense of native presence over absence. And then Weisner goes on to say that it is not a narrative of victimry. So that we cannot only teach boarding schools, we cannot only teach the Trail of Tears, we have to be teaching active native presence today. It is not enough to teach this narrative of victimry, which when Indigenous content does get taught in schools tends to be what gets taught. And that does not represent Indigenous futurity, it's past. So this curriculum that we've designed, we've also partnered with our own institution to offer professional development to teachers. We trained 55 teachers in June, and then we had 400 in a session that we did at Teachers College. So it's a small drop in the bucket to change hearts and minds, but we're working on centering pre-K through 12 classrooms Lenape presence. The photo on the side is an example of our answer to the 4th grade curriculum in New York City, make a Lenape log house and call it a day. It's a lesson called Who Are the Lenape, with a very deliberate emphasis on that word are as present. And you'll also notice that the lesson plan has colored pictures in it. And when our 4th grade teacher in New York City Public Schools, Liz Vassallo, does this PD, I've now done it with her twice, she really emphasizes that you have to print these in color, because in all of your textbooks, everything students see about Indigenous people is in black and white. And for young learners, they tend to associate that with being historic only. The other thing that surprises me when we do this with 4th grade teachers is 4th grade teachers become aware that they can talk about Indigenous issues as part of Current Issues Day. They can and they should. So we have some examples of the Ramapo Nation's pipeline protest a couple years ago. We also have an example of Stockbridge's Munsee composer Brent Davis. He did an opera, which teachers are also surprised to hear, and performed it at the Met, called The Purchase of Natacha. And then we also have an exhibit on Lunaapeewak from the Brooklyn Public Library in 2021. So a lot of times teachers are surprised to hear that they could be talking about Lenape presence. And so the 4th graders do not build log houses in these teachers' classrooms. They instead learn about current Lenape issues and what is happening today through doing a photo survey on these different photos. And I have a packet that I can pass around to share some responses. The teacher graciously blacked out the students' names and allowed me to do that. So I'll pass that around. But I also will pass around this great book called We Are Still Here, which is one of the books that we recommend teachers in 4th grade be using to talk about Indigenous presence fully. So I'll pass this around. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Natacha.
Hi, everyone. My name is Natacha Robert. I am a 3rd-year doctoral student in the Department of Curriculum and Teaching at Teachers College. I have been working with Rachel, who was my professor when we started this project. And I come to doing this work through my own research interest that led me to doing it. So my research focus is on African-centered education. And so seeing African people as Indigenous people, and also the history of colonization of African people in the African diaspora, and how that connects to decolonization. And Eve Tuck's work with Wayne Yang that talks about decolonization is not a metaphor, and how decolonization here is connected to decolonization everywhere. And so through doing that work and my history as a community organizer and doing things around decolonization, and also being a social studies teacher for 7 years myself. When I got the opportunity to work with the Public History Project and the Lunaape to do this curriculum, it really aligned with the stuff that I was already interested in and passionate about. So for us doing the curriculum, as Rachel said, we've been doing it for like the past 3 years. And one of the things that really guides us in doing is the transformational Indigenous praxis model. So that's from Dr. Karelle. And so he created this so that teachers can be able to learn, but not just teachers, but anybody who's also doing work around decolonization can be able to learn about themselves, but also build critical consciousness. And so as you see it here, it's almost like a triangle, but he's also come out with a book that's called Unsettling Settler Colonial Education. And so in that book, he has made it into waves. So showing the fluidity and the process that people go through when learning to elevate to a higher level of consciousness and also action. So the top tier of the TIPM is cultural and social justice action approach. So going from what they call a contributions approach, where a lot of the schools and the examples that Rachel was giving, where you just add in a little something here, you celebrate, Indigenous Peoples Day here, and, maybe you do something for November, but not including it as something that is throughout the school year, but also something that you then also take action outside of schools and doing something more active. And so that's the TIPM model, and it guides us in working not with just the curriculum, but also with teachers. So when we do the teacher PD, there's also a teacher PD that's connected to the curriculum that we're creating, so that they can go through the process and start to learn and critically reflect in terms of their critical consciousness and how much they can develop around decolonization. So we call the curriculum the Lenape land curriculum. So it's a land curriculum that aims to utilize Indigenous ways of knowing and worldview to support students in developing a critical understanding of interdependence between land and people. And so making sure that students we ground it in a unit. So it's about 5 units, and we ground it in a unit that talks about Indigenous worldviews, introduces students to that. So allowing them to be able to not just learn all of the history and all the current things that are happening in culture with the Lenape, but also what does it mean to look through an Indigenous lens? What does it mean to see the world through the 8 laws of the Lenape and through the principles of indigeneity as it relates to the Lenape? And so that's what it's grounded on, and it helps students to be able to then move through all the other units through this particular way of seeing, and eventually helping them to see that there are multiple worldviews, that the current Eurocentric worldview of how we see the world as humans being the top of what what has been constructed as a triangle, and that the earth is here and the land is here, and every entity on the earth is here for humans to use, is not the worldview. That is a worldview, that is the Eurocentric worldview that we've been following, that has led to a lot of the destruction and imperialism and colonization that we see today. But how can we see what it was pre-colonialism, what happened when you had European contact, and what has happened now, so they can build that critical consciousness to make those connections and to also analyze the world around them and eventually take action. So we grounded on the frameworks of tribal critical race theory by Brian Brayboy, TIPM, as I mentioned before. Key concepts that all of the units and the lessons have to target are decolonization, survivance, sovereignty, and Indigenous futurity. And all of those are connected to the works of Eve Tug, Ruben A. Gatz Tembide, Fernandez, Wayne Yang, Dolores Calderon, Jared Weisner, and Leilani Subzilian.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nancy. I am a third-year doctoral student at Teachers College, Columbia University. I am also an educator for many years. I was a middle school math teacher. I am currently a principal at a school of about 900 students and 100 staff members. And I come to this work with a desire to counteract the colonial logic and the forced assimilation that I see happening in public schools. So I became very interested in decolonization through Rachel and the work that we have done in collaboration with the Patterson the Public History Project and the Lenape for New Jersey. So we developed the Lenape land curriculum. We developed 5 units. We're in the process of developing 5 units. And the first unit, as Natacha mentioned, focused on indigenous ways of knowing. And in this part, it's important to start by centering how can we have teachers and students to think about topics from an indigenous lens, in which they are questioning the logic that have been in place. And it was important, again, to start with emphasizing how all the other topics that were in it will be approached. The second unit focused on colonial encounters, land dispossession, and forced migration. The third one was nation, treaties, and the Constitution. 4 is slavery, expansion, and continual removal. And the 5th unit is industrialization, immigration, and urbanization. The 5th unit is also very important because it ends in the present. It's trying to look at historical facts, but really focusing on what's happening today, especially with urbanization and the current link to the environment and the land. So every lesson in this curriculum is designed to work with teachers what they have in the classroom, what they're required to have in the classroom. So it addresses the social studies standards and science standards. It has essential questions, which frame every lesson at the beginning. There are key vocabulary. We also make sure to include common misconceptions, because we find that the current way in which the history of the Lenape is introduced in the classroom is carried lots of misconceptions that we want to make sure that the teachers are implicitly and intentionally addressing in the lesson. And there's also step-by-step instruction. So from this curriculum and other curriculums that we had, we also wanted to bring this idea, this concept to academia. And as Rachel mentioned, we had a PV, a professional development day for New York teachers. And from that came out a study that we are currently working on. There were 25 teachers that agreed to participate in the study. In the study is focusing on understanding how professional development, or what kind of learning we can help teachers in order to implement the curriculum in school. From this, we developed 6 codes that we're going to select 3 of them to talk about. But one of them was the willingness and wanting to learn, meaningful relationships with the Lenape, the land environment, language of unsettling, inspired to implement the desire, and barriers to implementing this curriculum.
And so one of the codes that Nancy mentioned was land and environment. It came up a lot in terms of what the teachers were saying before in the pre-survey that we gave them before they did the PD, and then the post-survey after. And so these 2 quotes right here that you see, one, I would like to learn more about how the Lenape lived on the land and managed the environment. So there's good intention and settler grammar's lack of present day. And then also with my students, we do teach and talk about land theft and colonial violence. And so one of the things that we noticed were those things in terms of, you know, teachers wanting to teach about land and environment and how Lenape interacted and, you know, lived in with the land. But also there were some stereotypical comments from teachers. One that said connection to nature and environmental stewardship as teaching about Native people. So that's what they mentioned. So there was a question about, you know, what do you teach? And so they felt that teaching about environmental stewardship was automatically teaching about the Lenape. So showing how they're not really teaching about the Lenape, but they're just teaching about the environment and equating that with teaching for decolonization or survivance. And so these are the types of things that we saw in terms of like this as an act of erasure in terms of settler moves to innocence, where you don't actually teach about the Lenape, who they are, but also just saying that if I do this, then I've hit the mark. And so we know that wherever, this is a quote by Eve Tuck, wherever you are situated in the world, there has likely been a long history of both human and more than human activity there. And so this is one of the sources that the students will use within the curriculum. This is what has been put together by the Public History Project through the historical records of the Lenape. and it's showing the future of Newark, what is, you know, the future Newark and future Manhattan, and going all the way back before even we think about human beings being on the land, but what is the story of the land? And so one of the lessons that we have is for students to engage with the story of the land. And when we call it landed curriculum, it's because we're centering land as an entity within itself that teaches you not just something that is just there for people to use, or that's something that we can just bypass, but something that has an active presence, that has a spirit within its own, and that is there for them to, that is there to teach us something. And so we use this as one of the, and there's many other ones like this, but I just use this to center how we can tell this, we center the story of land even before humans. And then another one, which were the barriers that teachers were saying that they felt that they faced, were comfort level and what this one teacher termed as bringing what I perceive to be sensitive content, and a lack of my own familiarization with the topic. Again, lack of knowledge and more community connections is something that they were also feeling like was a hindrance to them, and also curricular resources. One teacher noted that they would only teach settler colonialism to older or graduate students. So feeling like they couldn't teach it to younger students. And so given what we already know from research on K-12 content, we know that this wasn't surprising to us. And so Subzillion notes that teachers often say that they can't teach this content because they do not know it. And yet it is important to not say in a space where teachers forever wait. So with recognizing that and thinking about our curriculum and connecting it to how is the curriculum going to address or talk back to these things that are barriers to teachers. And so in doing our PDs, so this is two pictures of two PDs that we've led, one at Rutgers, another one at, I believe, because we had Chancellor's Day where we did a PD, but we also have Resi, which is another PD for teachers throughout New York City, actually throughout the United States. So people even come from other parts of the United States and attend Resi, and we also did a PD there for them as well. And so in doing that, making teachers get more comfortable. So in the same way that we ground the curriculum for the students and the units within understanding Indigenous ways of knowing, we also do the same thing for the teachers. So like I mentioned before, along with the units, we also have a PD that directly goes through it. So a lot of the things that the teachers will be learning through the PD, and also the experiences that they're going to have, because all of the units end with a trip, so that you're not just learning it within the classroom, but that you're actually going to be out on the land with Indigenous people eventually too, so that you're able to get not just a book learning, but you're actually able to get like real life learning and the real experiences that we're talking about, because you don't want to just talk about land and never be able to feel what it feels like to be able to learn and know that it's an entity and be able to experience that for yourself. And so the teachers will also be doing the same thing, taking the same trips, and so that they can get comfortable and feel like they have more knowledge about the topics that they're going to be teaching, instead of feeling like, okay, well, this is a PD and, you know, they just read the information. No, but they're going to experience a lot of what the students experience, so that they can build that familiarity and also the comfortability to say, okay, I know I can teach this, and I don't feel like it's too much or it's too much for younger students, but they've gone through the process of it.
So the great news is, almost to a person, all the teachers we surveyed showed a willingness and a wanting to learn and implement and desire this curriculum. And particularly they noted learning from instead of about, which we highly recommend for all teachers. Looking forward to teaching the origin story and the land river story that Nancy and Natacha talked about, and that they want to be in collaboration with the Lenape community. And they also really, Subzillion reminds us that Indigenous people should be positioned as active subjects, not agents, to learn from and not about. So not doing that passive learning. So one of the things that we did was we invited Lenape member Curtis Zuniga, who's Delaware Tribe of Indians and splits his time between Oklahoma and New York City. And he came to Teachers College and did some recording for us for the curriculum for younger learners. One of those is titled The Bear and Blue Corn, and was based on an experience Curtis had in 2021 in a field of blue corn. So really awesome to be able to do that work. We share a lot of resources with the teachers. So Public History Project, Roaring Peaceful Valley, which is the field trip that Natacha was alluding to, which takes students and their teachers up and down the Passaic River. We have 2 films, one, The Bear and the Blue Corn, Mannahatta. I really recommend, and I don't have a copy of When the Shad Bush Blooms because I keep ordering all their copies to give to teachers and they have to reprint it, but When the Shad Bush Blooms is a great book, also highlighting Lenape presence on the land that's now called Pennsylvania. And then Lunaapeewak Anthology, which is actually available as an ebook through the New York City Public Library. And I have a copy of the anthology on paper here, which I'm happy to pass around and give to someone. And so I think what I'm supposed to do now is click this magic link.
Yeah, you can click that one.
And we're supposed to see a little bit of Bear in the Blue Corn. So I will share this with you, and we'll have a little bit of story.
Hello, Winkly Cheek. It's me, Chulente, little bird from Inwood Park at the tippy top of the island of Manhattan. Lately, I've been thinking about what Manhattan was like before it became the Kitutene, or city it is today. Today, we're going to go on a journey together to learn more about the Lenape and Lenape land from Lenape people. This week, we are going to hear from Curtis of the Delaware tribe of Indians. He's going to share a story about a Lenape boy and his encounter with a furry visitor.
Hello, my name is Curtis Zuniga. I'm an enrolled member of the Delaware tribe of Indians. In our traditional language, I am known as Lenape. Lenape ni, I am Lenape. This is the story of the bear and the blue corn. As the boy stepped out of his wigwam, he felt the cool morning air and the sunshine on his skin. He walked out to the cornfield behind the village so that he could pull weeds and scare away the birds. The birds and the bugs like to eat bits and pieces of sesopsing, a blue corn that had been grown in that field for many generations. This was the land called Lunaapeewak. The boy did not know that there was someone already in the cornfield. Mak, the bear, was there with her little cub. They had come out of the forest looking for food. They came into the cornfield, and when they ate the blue corn, they knew that it was the same corn that their ancestors had eaten many generations ago. They were happy to eat the special corn, just like their grandparents had done so many years ago. It carried the spirit of their ancestors. When the boy started walking down the rows of corn, he was startled by broken stalks and torn ears of corn. He heard an animal noise near the field. It was a sound that he had never heard before. When he stepped out of the tall corn, he looked down the row and saw a baby bear and its mama waddling back into the woods. He was frightened at first because he knew that the mama would fiercely protect her little cub. When he went back into the field, he saw so much of the field had been trampled and so much of the corn had already been eaten. Then he stepped into something soft and squishy. It was a fresh pile of bright blue bear poo. Oh my, the boy became very angry at those bears. He cleaned his moccasins, and then he gathered up as much corn as he could hold in his shirt. When he went back to the wigwam, his grandfather was sitting there lighting his pipe. Grandfather listened to the boy as he told his story of the bear and the blue corn. Grandfather then blew a puff of smoke into the air and told the boy not to be angry, with the bear, for Mach had come to the forest to taste the special corn and remember his ancestors. He told the boy to respect the bear spirit and to sing this song whenever he told the story. The bear is coming, spirit of an ancestor. He brings good medicine. He eats blue corn. The bear is coming, spirit of an ancestor. She brings her cub. They eat blue corn. The bear is coming, spirit of an ancestor. We all eat blue corn.
Now, let's review some of the Lenape words we used in our video today. Repeat after Curtis.
Say sopsing. Say sopsing. Say sopsing. Lunaapeewak. 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 Mach. Mach. Mach.
As you learned today during your sharing circle, we end each of our stories by giving thanks to the storyteller. On the count of 3, let's all say wanishi, or thank you, Curtis. 3, 2, 1. Wanishi, Curtis. That's all for today, Memensak. Until next time.
I tell teachers because Curtis gifted us this story and he told us that whenever we played it, we needed to make sure we play it all the way to the end so that we are a good keeper of stories and holder of stories, and also that we always thank the storyteller. So every time we watch this video, we do that to honor Curtis and the fact that Curtis shared stories with us. And with that, I want to say thank you, Wanishi, to all of you for sharing in this work with us.
Well, we welcome Garland.
Hi, Claire Garland. For those of you who were here this summer, Velma brought up the fact that there was an issue with the state library, at the state museum. And I just wanted to give you an update on that. First, I'm the director of the Sandhill Indian Historical Association. I serve on the New Jersey Commission of American Indian Affairs as a resource person, and I also serve with the New Jersey Historical Commission. I was co-chair of the Year of Indigenous People, and there are at least 24 programs on the YouTube channel for New Jersey Historical that you can use in your classes for discussion and information. Last July, it was brought to our attention that there were a number of boxes of bones at the State Museum. We took this back, it was on the agenda at our last meeting, and the commission scheduled a meeting with Margaret O'Reilly, who is the director of the State Museum. They agreed to contact the National Park Service, that's also involved in repatriation, and the Department of Interior. So the commission decided that it did not want items that belonged here in New Jersey sent to Western nations. And I will let Suzanne know as I find out more about the steps that they're taking. Just a little bit to talk about today. I served on this Indigenous Education Project. The New Jersey Historical Commission contracted with Education Northwest to learn more about how to address gaps in accessible resources and information across content areas for educators and students in the state of New Jersey, with a focus on inclusive and current information. We met from September of last year to June of this year, convened in a multidisciplinary New Jersey American Indian Ed for All committee, and it was comprised of tribal leaders for state and federal nations, educators, scholars, organizations, nonprofit leaders, and other experts to help establish goals and objectives. The report outlined a 5-year plan that included a vision statement, goals, objectives for future phases of the project. It reviewed the historical context of the First Peoples of New Jersey, the national indigenous education movement, the current Native education landscape in New Jersey, data collection and summary of findings, drafted a vision statement, goals, objectives, and references. Might be a little too light for you to see, but the New Jersey 2020 Social Studies Standards included 21 specific references to Native history and civics, includes Lenape experiences and culture. The standards are due for revision in 2025. It was noted that the Amistad Commission is allocated $1 million from the state budget to support African-American education in the state and employs 4 full-time employees. And yet there is not 1 cent allotted to Indigenous education in the state of New Jersey. The groups that were involved in this, there were 127 educators, 22 caregivers, 57 community leaders that all responded to surveys. Stockbridge Munsee community, Mohegan Indians, Delaware, Powhatan National Park Service, Museum, Rutgers University, the Trent House, to name a few. Educators requested lesson plans, reading list, textbooks, arts, crafts, videos, visual aids, online resources, literature, arts, web-based, a repository for related content, a place for educators to locate information, teaching tools, research, videos, items that have been vetted for authenticity, accuracy, and value. The vision statement was a 5-year plan. Year 1, visibility and awareness. Goal setting, building a coalition, developing a social media and website presence for curated material, locating organizations to help build a network of support and establish philanthropic partners. Year 2 was develop understandings of tribal histories, awareness, and legislative advocacy. Convening a coalition, getting funding, building a 1-year calendar of conferences and events, establishing a clearinghouse for appropriate and relevant, vetting organizations who can work with educators, and researching other state native education for all laws and draft New Jersey law. Year 3 was developing curriculum and materials for training. Year 4 and 5 was implementation, setting up pilot projects, getting feedback and evaluation, and statewide implementation and grants. This was one of the resources that we used. Findings of Reclaiming Native Truth, the website is there. And as you can see, 87% of state history standards do not even mention Native American history after 1900. 27 states make no mention of a single Native American in K-12 curriculum. Also, the National Congress of American Indians, known as NCAI, report in 2019 was called Becoming Visible. Current efforts to bring high quality educational content into K-12 classrooms. Accessing state resources and public funds to establish statewide curriculum, including content of Native Americans and state standards, essential understandings, core content, tribal specific curriculum, building momentum in state legislators to advance the agenda, identifying champions, allies, leaders, organizations, nonprofits, and community partners to advocate for the work. New Jersey Department of Education lacks the state funding to hire a responsible person for this project and did not respond to the survey or information from the Becoming Visible report. 15 states reported having state funding for Native American education. 75 organizations, 75 funded positions across the United States for Native American education. In the whole United States, 75 positions. The current New Jersey landscape standards of 2020 include 21 references to Native American history and civics. They include Lenape experience and culture, and form a foundation to build curriculum that supports teaching content. New Jersey has a solid foundation for work, Northwest Education felt, because it has established organizations, organized educators and school leaders. It has New Jersey Historical Commission, New Jersey Indigenous Education for All Committee, and the New Jersey Commission on American Indian Affairs that would all push for this to happen. And request, I already said, references that we used. The National Congress of American Indians from 2019, Becoming Visible, and the website is there. Reclaiming Native Truth from 2018, research findings, and that's rntfirstnations.org. Also, the book Soderlund from 2015, Lenape Country, and her new book, Separate Paths, which is just excellent when it comes to New Jersey history. Also, Wallstrom, and the website is Wallace Foundation, just to give you a few. So this is a long project, and we all hope that we can move forward, taking step by step. Somebody has to do it. Thank you.
Well, Paul will be our next speaker. And then we'll hear from Ian McCallum, and there'll be time for questions before our
So one of the ways that I've tried to gauge how my students in New Jersey are learning a little bit about Lenape history or Native history in general is by interacting with my undergraduate students that I teach. So I'm a graduate student at Rutgers University. So Rutgers being the state university, we get students from all across the state. And so when I'm teaching them and talking to them, it really helps to give me a sense of what it is they are and are not learning in schools. And so I was guest lecturing in a class just this past week, so last Monday. And we were talking about place names and naming practices as forms of colonial erasure. And so I was asking my students to consider what are some of the reasons, what led to this place that we live in right now being called New Jersey? And ask them to think about why do most of you not know the name Lunaapeewak or anything Lenape? And so I had one student very confidently raise his hand and say, because the settlers killed all the Lenape people. So that just gave me, that taught me something a little bit about what information many of these students were coming in with, and really helped me to sort of think about, what can be my contribution to, shifting some of that. So some of the projects that I've worked on, Claire talked about a little bit about the work that the commission has done to try to advance
Native education in the state of New Jersey. So I'm specifically working on a project with the Trent House Museum, and they are working with me and a few other individuals from the Nanticoke Lenape community to create educational videos that can be just shown in classrooms, because there's so many different teachers that she already mentioned that and so did our teachers college representatives, that there's many teachers that want to teach this history and want to teach this information, but they also don't have some of these resources and they're not really sure different, like, how to go about it. And so as just one tiny bit to help this project, we are in the process of creating 3 different short educational videos that are just sort of supposed to be introductions to the Lenape peoples who are in New Jersey today, and a little bit about our history and removal. So it's not at all supposed to be a comprehensive history of all Lenape communities, but it's to give them an idea, one, that we are still here, because that as a concept is still very foreign to many of these students, but also just gives them a jumping off point to explore more topics in depth. And so, we're teaching them a variety of things about political history and ongoing contemporary politics, concerns about ecological knowledge and sort of indigenous and colonial models of conservation and sort of engagement with the environment. We talk about language loss and theft and erasure, as well as stereotypes and social media representations and things like that. So different topics that can be, that will help the students to think more about our communities. And in doing these projects, we, the Trent House, hired people from our community, and we interviewed others from our community, and we collected stories from them and different teachings that they had that they wanted to get out there to other students in the state. And so we're in the process of compiling all these different interviews and into these videos that we're going to be able to present to the school systems. Another project that I'm working on is with the Philadelphia Public Schools through the Penn Museum. Now the Penn Museum, of course, has a very long and complicated history and ongoing complicated history with Lenape peoples. But for my little pocket, I'm working with their, they're called like international classroom educators. And so they offer workshops to students from the Philadelphia area who come to the museum on field trips. And so we do workshops with the students in-house in the museum on various topics. And so I'm teaching the students a little bit specifically about Lenape language and food. And so not only, introducing them to the basics like the 3 sisters, but also getting them to consider some of the violent political and social history as to, why we have commercial farming right now versus, why isn't everybody growing these 3 sisters garden? Why haven't you seen many of these, why haven't you seen blue corn in the grocery stores? Why are you only seeing yellow corn? So not only teaching them sort of the basics of, Native people grow corn, beans, and squash, but also really getting them to think about some of these more difficult questions, particularly because most of the students that I work with are middle schoolers and high schoolers. So, they're able to embrace some of these complex thoughts. And so, I'm hoping to engage more with that. And then lastly, I wanted to also add, when I speak with different educators about, how they can incorporate more Lenape knowledge into their curricula, I really continue to encourage them to sort of think outside the box as to what that means. And so it's very easy to think about how they want to incorporate a segment on Lenape history when they're talking about sort of US history or global history. But that doesn't need to be the limit of what they are including in their curricula. So when I talk to people who work on, you know, English language and literature, and I was like, if you're doing a semester on poetry, you know, who are the authors that you're selecting in your work? Look through that list and think about what different communities those people are coming from. There are so many different Indigenous artists and poets that you can include their work. And so that's another way to engage with our people rather than just thinking about us as sort of a segment on, you know, on history. The same thing with anyone teaching these civics and government courses and political courses at all different levels. When we learn about US history or, you know, US law, and thinking about the connections between our, you know, our federal government systems and our state government systems, we should always be including our, you know, Indian law as part of this, because it's really fundamental to how our country works. And it's so integral to think about this relationship between the federal government and the state government and tribal nations. And it should be a part of, you know, all levels of government education. When you're, you know, learning about, you know, Schoolhouse Rock videos, you know, we should have, you know, our own little version of that to also incorporate and think about, you know, tribal sovereignty as part of that discussion. And those are just, you know, a few examples of how we really want to push educators to think about incorporating Lenape peoples, not just our history or segments of our culture, but also recognizing us as, you know, as contributors to literature, to physics, to arts, to science, and all of these different elements that are part of education. Thank you.
Just to say, and McCallum.
I know I've shared this with many of you, but in my daytime job, I work for the province of Ontario in the Indigenous Education Office. So I've sort of pushed the family business to the provincial level, I guess, on our side of the border. Usually when I say that, it involves people throwing food or booze or things like that working for the government. And it's not an easy choice to work for what's perceived as an institution that has prevented Indigenous education from being at the forefront. But I thought, I'm going to start off positive, and then I'm going to work back through a little bit of history. So as of 2 weeks ago, I'm on Munsee-Delaware, we've completed the grade 10 history course that can be used as an optional. So in grade 10, students can, they have to take a history credit. This is an optional credit that can be provided for Munsee-Delaware students and students as a whole in the province of Ontario that deals with Munsee-Delaware history, but also our travels and tribulations all the way back to the homelands. So that's a very recent piece. And one that I'm excited about, because in 51 years, if I go back in time, the only way you were going to see Indigenous education in the classroom in the 1970s was if my mom came into the classroom. And I didn't really like having my mom in the classroom. You couldn't get away with things, and my mom tended to be a bit severe. She's a teacher, and she would give you the stare, which meant you were in trouble in the classroom, but you got into more trouble at home, right? Talking to. I attended the very first Aboriginal teacher ed program on campus at Queen's University in 1995. I graduated in 1996, which is also the first year, it's the year that the last residential school closed in Canada. So a watershed moment in terms of Indigenous education. When I started teaching, I didn't teach what I was supposed to. The Bering Strait Land Bridge figured quite heavily in grade 6 social studies. My kids didn't want to learn about the Bering Strait land bridge. Most of them came from Rama First Nation or from Christian Island or came from Six Nations. They don't want to hear that their ancestors supposedly crossed this bridge of ice and came to North America. So I taught local, right? And I didn't teach about the plains and I didn't teach about the West Coast because I'm Munsee. What do I know about the plains? What do I know about Northern Ontario? What do I know about BC? That's not my story to tell. And so I invited people in from Rama and Christian Island to come in and share their own history with the students. So that's that whole making connections. There's one thing I'm not afraid to do is dial a mean finger. I may not have a lot of skills in terms of being able to fix cars and do woodworking, but boy, can I dial a mean finger, right? Find people who can do the work in the right way. And so I've always held true to that. In 2007, a principal, the only Indigenous principal I've ever worked for, plucked me out of my school and said, we need you to help with implementing what was called the First Nations Métis and Inuit Policy Framework. So in the province of Ontario decided that Indigenous education was really important. They created a policy that all school boards must follow. And that was in 2007. So I worked for the school board. Now, Simcoe County District School Board is a mid-sized school board in Ontario. It has 100+ schools. You're looking at about 25 to 30,000 students and about 5,000 staff. So it's a very large geographical board, but it's also a mid-sized in terms of population in our province, which meant I lived out of my car for a very long time, going around to support the work in the schools. We worked with our two communities, so Rama and Christian Island, to help implement the policy framework because their students come to our schools. And so we wanted to make sure that the perspectives that were being offered to teachers and teacher candidates, new teacher program, that they receive that sort of training from not people who aren't from those communities, but from those who are. To add to that, we also have a group called the Métis Nation of Ontario. So on Georgian Bay, the Métis community of Penetanguishene is rather large, one of the largest in the province. So we had two Indigenous communities, we had one Métis community, and then we worked with Ottawa, the Inuit community in Ottawa, to infuse the Inuit perspective as well for our students. And this wasn't a grade 6 targeted thing, this was K to 12. Some things that we did, and I could go on all day long about my times because there were some very interesting and exciting times. We brought smudging into the schools. So you can smudge in all Simcoe County and for that most provincial schools without it being a problem, except the school that I taught at, which had a custodian that liked to pull rank. So we had to have long conversations about that. We don't celebrate, but we acknowledge the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation on the 30th September. That is something that just happens. It's not something that is, a must do. We do professional development in communities. So I was listening to the presentation to start. Our teachers go to those communities. So they don't, the communities don't have to come to our school board office, the central place, the bastion of all knowledge. We send our teachers out to the communities to learn. So there's that reciprocity between the communities themselves and the school board. We have an Indigenous language program. I drive my son 20 minutes a day to Orillia, Ontario from my home. So I'm in Orillia I drive to Orillia 4 times. And then if I coach at night, I'm there 6 times. He wants to take the Ojibwe language program because there's no Munsee language program in Simcoe County, but there's Ojibwe language. So we made a conscious effort as a grade 8 student to say, I really do want to learn Ojibwe. How can I get to that school? So we made that happen for him as parents to make sure that he got there. So Ojibwe language is taught in 5 of our schools. That includes 2 high schools. From a professional development model, we used a collaborative approach. So as a resource teacher, I would work with teachers in schools to develop their plan for grade 6, let's say grade 6 social studies or grade 5 social studies, to implement a plan that was well-founded and brought Indigenous perspectives in. We also had the ability to access community resources. So oftentimes there's a third-party education organization that will work on behalf of First Nation communities. And in my region, in the Barrie region, it's an hour north of Toronto, and it stretches from Lake Huron all the way to Lake Ontario. There's an education body known as the Ogimawaj Tribal Council that actually creates resources that they share with school boards, but they are based on Rama First Nation, and they create resources that are vetted by their communities. Not fast forwarding, going back a bit, but this information and this work is based on the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1995. More recently, though, we have the calls to action. Embedded within the 94 calls to action is number 62 and number 63, which that is sort of our marching orders. Also with UNDRIP is also the other piece that sort of provides me the guidance on a daily basis. Provincially, I work with 12 school boards, and they range in terms of size. But with Claire's stat about 75 funded positions across the United States, I have well more than that in just my 12 school boards that work with Indigenous education. And I might say that not all of that comes from provincial funding. The school boards themselves have deemed it important enough that they're going to self-fund those jobs. So that means that they don't call me up on the phone and say, Ian, we need funding for 3 positions for Indigenous education. They get that out of the funds generated by the number of students in their enrollment. More than 75 positions. That includes Indigenous language speakers, social workers, child and youth workers. I'm going to go through, I'm missing some. Grad coaches, because our big thing now is we've moved the needle in terms of here's where we are in terms of our infusion of cultural awareness or Indigenous worldview, but now we're trying to address the achievement gap between Indigenous students and the population, the other populations in Ontario. So I feel for that. 75 jumped off, and broke my heart a bit when that slide went up. From a provincial standpoint, and I was busy texting Melissa on Tuesday, well, not while driving. She wanted an answer about me coming down here, and I was caught between a small town called Lindsay, Ontario, and I was going down to Whitby. So these are 2 towns that are east of Lake Simcoe, just north of Lake Ontario. And I was visiting the Wata community, which is Mohawk-speaking community. And then I was also coming down to Scugog Island, which is a Mississauga nation. So I was working with school boards and working with their communities to support what they'd like to do with provincial money in this school board year. Some things that the province has done in the absence of an approved slide deck, which usually I have to talk about, is we've revised the social studies and history curriculum. I'll slow down. It's been revised from grades 1 to 8. That includes additional references to local communities and Indigenous worldview. We also have high school courses, grades 9 through 12, that not only address Indigenous studies, so students can take Indigenous studies in grade 11. It's known by its course code as NBV, which is Native Voice. But you can also take Indigenous English courses. And most of my school boards have made that mandatory. That's a big deal because a lot of teachers in grade 11 love to teach Shakespeare. Who doesn't love the Bard, right? However, most students in Ontario have witnessed Shakespeare for some time. In grade 8 class, in my elementary school where I taught, we had to perform, it was our duty to perform a Shakespeare play every year. So I had to, grade 8s were in for Hamlet this year. We're like, this is what we're gonna do. Anyways, it's a big change because teachers they like a certain program and they feel comfortable. Now we're being challenged to read Indigenous stories. Drew Hayden Taylor, right? You're being asked to read David Robertson, You're asked to now touch upon those subjects that are challenging, as was mentioned. You're now having to talk about residential schools, you're having to talk about 60s scoop, you're having to talk about missing murdered Indigenous women and girls. You're having to talk about treaties, and that's a huge challenge, and it still is a challenge. I have a lot of pushback from different boards where they're not able to implement that. In addition, I've in our provincial system, we have Catholic school boards and provincial school boards. So the Catholic boards themselves are struggling with the papal apology that happened last year, right? And how to implement that and how to connect that with Indigenous worldview, and they're getting there. We have, as I said before, we've got the language programs in high school. We have world religion, which incorporates. We have visual art. And a little known thing, which school boards are now asking me about, is you can make any course in high school an N course, an Indigenous perspectives course, but you have to change the curriculum, you have to change the course. So that's up to a teacher where they can actually go and say, you know what, I'm gonna be teaching, here's one that I know. I'm teaching aesthetics, hair styling aesthetics as part of a tech course. You can turn that into an N course by simply revamping what you're teaching, bring in those Indigenous perspectives. So that's something that I know school boards are looking at now because the funding model has changed a little bit. In addition, in provincial, we look at the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. Treaty Week is coming up, and that's something that provincially we all do. Missing murdered Indigenous women, the Métis Louis Riel Day. The two exciting things I thought I should mention, we have land-based learning. So this is now becoming a part of consideration across many school boards. I have schools that access a community on the Bruce Peninsula known as Navesink, and the students they take a suite of courses in grade 11, which include Indigenous English, Indigenous Studies. They'll take a phys ed and art, but they'll also take a couple of other courses. And what they do is they get together with the community in Navesink, and the students go out there and do land-based learning in the wintertime. They partake in maple syrup, basking making. We learn about the fisheries program because it's right on Georgian Bay and Lake Huron. It's an exciting course, and that's not isolated. I've seen school boards that work with teaching kids about wild rice because we have the shallow lakes to the east of us. Farming. The farming one was less popular because the kids like, do we have to weed? But I mean, they engaged Rama First Nation, who has a farm, and the students went out there to learn. And then some students actually got to build a lodge, so they had to put their construction technique together. Here's the biggest issues that I see as a former teacher, because I'm no longer a teacher in a school board. But there's a couple things that are still those barriers. One, if you're a new teacher, you often are overwhelmed and you don't know what you don't know. And teachers want to access teachers pay teachers. And I don't want to say I don't like teachers pay teachers because there's lots of other resource banks that you can do, but that one tends to get people into a lot of trouble because it's not a vetted resource. It's somebody's item that they put up there so that they can get money back. And if it's not vetted by community, then you're going to run into some issues. And that's why I always say, if you don't know what to do, you don't know where to go, you gotta call. Dial that mean finger, make connections, make friends with local community. I didn't know anybody from Rama or Christian Island when I started teaching in Aurelia in 1998. You can bet by the end of that first week in school, though I did, I knew who I needed to talk to, right? And that's always held in good respects. Like, it's always, you're respecting the local communities, but you're also moving the needle as a teacher and as an educator. So I come back to that grade 10 history course now that we have on Munsee. So students who may not want to take the grade 10 history course and learn about Canadian history now have an option to learn their own history, which is awesome. So I'll leave it there. Nishi. Teachers.
I'm gonna speak to all of our speakers. We now have about half an hour to have hopefully engaging discussion and to have time to hear all of your questions about the place of Lenape people in the wider curriculum, ways that you all want to be seen by the public, how to make those connections, difficult connections with the state or the province, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll open it up to all of you.
Yeah, just one thing I wanted to say there. In researching other topics and all, I have come across a number of diplomatic trips across the ocean. And the first one I ran into was from a London Gazette newspaper from 1762. 4 Cherokee chiefs traveled over to see King George. They were there a few months. They signed the proclamation of 1763, which drew a line and forced people on one side of the mountains or the other. And of course, kind of fired up the revolution as a few years later. But in doing research, I've run across all these diplomatic trips from different nations to the King of France, to the King of England, back and forth across the ocean, must be a dozen of them that I never heard about or knew about. And even Squanto, the one we hear about with Thanksgiving and the pilgrims and all of that, made several trips back and forth. And I feel as though, why is it that we hear about warriors and savages and uncouth, dirty, this, that, and the other, but we never hear about the diplomatic missions that went on, trying to keep the peace, trying to honor the treaties that were made? Why don't we hear about that? Why isn't that part of this story that kids grow up knowing about? Why do I have to read it in a London newspaper? Why isn't it here? Why don't we know about that kind of information? How much effort that went into trying to keep the peace, trying to stay neutral, not to take a side. And you know, just the research has been really enlightening. So I just wanted to share, it's not a question, but just wanted to share that.
I have 3 thoughts, so I hope that's fine. The first is sort of immediately in response to your comment about cross-ocean diplomacy. One of my colleagues, who's a Canadian historian in Canada, her name is Cecilia Morgan, and she's recently published a book that kind of profiles a lot of these international diplomatic trips. Another historian, Cole Rush, who teaches in British Columbia, has also written books about those histories. And what I like about both of them that can kind of be integrated into a school perspective as well, and a historical teaching perspective, is we very much have embedded in our forms of teaching for Indigenous history, teaching from east to west. That's what we see in Canada, and that's what we see in the United States as well. When we teach history, especially non-Indigenous history, we teach from the beginning of the story in the east to kind of full settlement in the west. And one thing that I have done in my teaching on the university level is use delegations such as what you've just mentioned to kind of problematize that idea about how we very much teach from east to west in a lot of what we do. And that really starts to challenge students. And if you frame a lesson as being about problematizing that narrative structure, I find it's really beneficial for students. And I think it can be done kind of from that K-12 perspective as well, instead of just university. One thing as well, you know, I read an article years ago, and I forget who wrote it, but I always use this concept in my course, especially when teaching history in Canada. But I remember reading this concept about how in Canadian history, Indigenous peoples are kind of perceived as the significant other, and Black Canadians are kind of like erased from the historical narrative, generally speaking, whereas in the United States, it's almost flipped, where African Americans are the significant other in historical scholarship and Indigenous peoples are erased from the curriculum. I think that's a really interesting concept as well, to kind of look at how both countries in their forms of teaching and curricular development have sort of chosen or selected one group as what they're going to kind of essentialize. And it's really helpful again for looking at our curriculum structures, because in Canada, our teaching of Black Canadian history is very poor. You know, especially when you relate it to kind of Indigenous histories, as Ian's done, you know, if you look at Indigenous history in the curriculum, it's a lot more prevalent than Black Canadian history is as well. And this is more a question, and I don't know how to word this in such a way, but, you know, and maybe Ian has some examples as well to draw upon, but one thing that I've been so fascinated about from sort of being in this context is there's been some sort of, I would say, controversy and scandal in Canada when you have some teachers in the elementary school system who are using terms such as Indian, which is kind of an outdated term in Canada. And it's actually, teachers are kind of getting into a bit of scandal if they're using that in their class, but it's definitely not the context in the United States. And I just wonder, for those who are doing curriculum work in the United States, if that has if there actually has been any of that discussion where that term is perhaps being pushed back against, because, and again, sorry Ian to put you on the spot like 3 times in a row, but you know, there is actually kind of well-known examples where teachers are using sort of the term Indian to refer to Indigenous peoples, but are getting in trouble for doing that because it's deemed derogatory and outdated. So that's more a thought than anything, but just any thoughts on all of those concepts that I've just thrown to the table?
Well, I can tell you, in law school,
Right,
it's federal Indian law,
yeah,
and that is ingrained in the law and in the curriculum at the law school level, and I don't think that it's.
I think it's interesting as well, because in Canada, for example, we have the Indian Act, which is very much like a specific term which we use and teach. And in our constitution, there's constitutionally protected Aboriginal rights, which we use as kind of the legal term in that context as well. But then I think, so we see Indian in that context, we see Aboriginal in that specific context, but when it comes to kind of general discussion, yeah, it's interesting because the language is kind of politicized in different contexts, but we're seeing a level of pushback, I think.
Well, where does the word come from? So they're going east to west, and they thought they were in India, I guess.
I think it's more so like just normalize in the Canadian context, and if other Canadians, Scotland, others from Canada want to say, I think it's just like normalizing that as the word that's being used to teach is kind of perceived as generalist and outdated. You're almost kind of nodding your head, so I'm going to kind of up to you. But it is interesting because there is that very much a different dialogue, whereas here, there's that doesn't seem to be that same conversation, which is really just more of an observation than anything. Sorry.
Indians are the only group written into the US Constitution as a group of people.
Right.
Nobody else, but Indians are there.
Right.
So they are recognized as nations.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not moderating, but.
I think we'll definitely say it's a discussion of what to use. And funny enough, the Museum of the American Indian has put out a teaching aid that I've definitely people who've asked me this question used before to kind of be like, well, this was this community built about what to use and also actually how to have conversations that are community focused about what to use, because different communities might have different answers to that within the United States. So if you just call the impact of words and tips for using appropriate terminology, am I using the right word? But it's on the American Indian Museum website.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I can't speak for the curricular perspective, but there's definitely a conversation around that going on down here as well.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, and to add to that, I feel like part of the issue is that there isn't currently a single term that doesn't have any negative or difficult connotations associated with it.
Right.
And so the reason there's so much debate, at least down here, is just because everyone's trying to decide which is the lesser form of evil that we want to use to talk about it. There isn't. So we encourage people when we're talking about individual tribal nations. I think there's always sort of that goal of using whatever their nation is called.
Yeah.
But then when we're having those generalized conversations, the term Indian, of course, has a very long and complicated history with it. And a lot of people choose not to do that, to use that term. But then the term Native American is also, has a difficult like history alongside it. Particularly, people arguing that, like we don't want to be called Native American because we're not American, like, like trying to like put us into like, they think it further sort of makes them be considered as domestic dependent nations. And then you also have this term indigenous, which is gaining popularity, but the problem with indigenous is that, indigenous like is a global term and it's a political term and it's a term that like, if we're talking specifically about Native peoples of North America, like, who are indigenous, but if you're using this broad term indigenous, then you're sort of tapping into these other sort of global indigenous conversations, which may not always be what your goal is in that situation.
Right.
So, yeah, those aren't any answers, but that's just sort of, exploring why these are, is a charged discussion.
Give another perspective to tell her this, it's a journalistic perspective of media. So journalism is Native American Journalism Association. It just changed their name to Indigenous Media Association this year. And they have Associated Press standards, for all of journalism in the US. And they have a NAJA, which is now still getting used because it's like the last month or so it's changed names. But they have their own Associated Press style standards for Indigenous media, Indigenous issues. And so that goes out to tribal journalism, and it also goes out to mainstream journalism covering Indigenous affairs. Their official perspective on the styles is that any of those, American Indian is acceptable, it's usually American Indian together, Native American, and Indigenous. Those three are acceptable within journalistic media, with a preference going to whenever possible to identify by tribal affiliation. And one thing that I've heard both from the Journalism Association as well as the people I work with who are very much trying to have a large net is Indigenous. They intentionally use Indigenous to push against the colonial divisions. And Indigenous also recognizes so many people, so many populations that either haven't been able to be officially recognized as a tribe, or so it intentionally covers, certainly in this hemisphere, an experience. So that's just a perspective.
Just as a really quick follow-up, one thing that's interesting as well is I think it speaks broadly and kind of benefits of this panel is when you look at sort of homelands of Indigenous nations that we're talking about today are obviously cross-border, but when you're looking at educational resources, there's always going to be, even just the use of the word tribe, like tribal is not used in Canada,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
So it's really interesting to think about those conversations where there's obviously going to be techniques and ways to build community partnerships, but it's interesting that in a lot of cases, the resources that are developed from a community perspective in a lot of ways would still need significant revision again, just to kind of address, even though it's the same homelands, it's sort of those different structural systems that have then made some of the teaching materials, non-translatable between the two systems. Just general thoughts.
Well, tribal is another word that has
exactly legal, but then
and the word indigenous, when we were talking about law, constitutional law, but not international law. And so we talked about homelands. Are the Palestinians indigenous people? Do they have a nation? They apparently do not. And are not the First Nation people. That's, if you take that word literally, you're a nation. And why don't you have a seat in the United Nations? So sovereignty has to be asserted and come forward and say, so this is our nation and we want to have, we want to be part of the conversation.
This is my own question, if that's okay. I'd love to just hear more from Rachel and your team about like next steps or kind of the long-term direction. I know you talked about it a little bit, but kind of where you're hoping to go from here, and also, you know, ties with this place as well.
I mean, our long-term goal is that there's Indigenous education that's mandated pre-K through 12 for everybody in New York and New Jersey, and gosh, if we got done with that before we all left the earth, then you know, everywhere else. I mean, that's like the big far-reaching goal. And you know, when I talk to teachers and they're like, when is it enough? I'm like, we're so far from it being enough. So far from that. So I think that's the long-term goal. But to get to that, you have to have generations of teachers who are in teacher education and generations of students who are going to be teachers. You get way out of the settler mindset and the settler goals. So I think for now, it's as much as we can, professional development, as much as I can get out of Teachers College and Columbia next door. When people call and say, can you do this? Can you come here? Can you go here? Can you come to this museum? Columbia apparently has a planetarium, and they're like, you should come present at the planetarium, and we'd have space for 200 teachers. I'm like, yes, great. So, I mean, the goal is just as much as we can get the curriculum out, get more units of it out. I know one of the things the early childhood educators have asked for, and I'm trying to do some fundraising for, because we always pay the Lenape people who do the curriculum consultation with us. We do it as volunteers, but we pay them, is early childhood educators would love to see a video similar to what we have Curtis doing with Natacha and Bear and Blue Corn, where Lenape youth, like kindergartners, first and second graders, are talked to really make some good age appropriate connections, just them being interviewed. So I know that's one thing we're hoping, because sadly, when we test taught these videos to really young students, right? So the person who helped with this curriculum with Curtis was teaching 3- and 4-year-olds. Their biggest takeaway were that Lenape people were still alive and that they had a language. And they're at 3 and 4 years old, and already those ideas, those settler ideas, are already in their minds. So I'm really convinced that although I'm a high school person at heart, and I spend a lot of time working on the high school curriculum, that we have to focus really early, because we can't keep getting to where your students are and they're saying the Lenape are gone. We can't keep doing that. We have to start much earlier. So I mean, that's the long term, and to have many units, right? We're at the point now where we have a unit for pre-K all the way through 12 for all the grades, but Natacha and Nancy are expanding and building out full units of study so teachers can do far more than this. But gosh, it'd be great if we had a policy mandate, and I'm all in for whatever work in New Jersey and New York and whatever other states. Like, we'll come, we'll be there, we'll testify, we'll bring research. Like, that's one of the reasons why we're doing the research now, is so it can be helpful in that way.
And the goal also is to hopefully in the spring have 2 more solid units to go along with the first unit, and also 2 more field trips, because getting students to interact with the land, but also even in urban environments, and to start thinking about what does that look like, and really hoping that teachers and students can start to think about their own like relationship to the land that they're in, even if it's an urban environment that, you know, you're not always around, like trees and other and like, you know, different types of animals and things like that. So hopefully in the spring, and then do also another a longer PD with teachers, hopefully within New Jersey, and use that as part of the research too, to see how does prolonged engagement with PD over a long period of time affect the way that they're able to teach it, and also what more supports do they need?
I have 2 things related to what you guys are talking about. So right now, so I'm Lenape. I grew up in New York, but right now we live in Massachusetts. And so my son's in 8th grade, and I was looking at his history book, and there's like nothing on Native people, let alone Lenape. But so, you know, I'm on the school board, and I help out and volunteer and stuff. So I said to the principal, like, hey, there's nothing in your curriculum about Native people. And I was like, well, like, you know, how would I be able to change that? You know, and I didn't know about you guys. But so like, I mean, we can talk about it, but he said, okay, this is the person you can meet with and get them curriculum and then you can talk to it. And they would like work it into potentially the 8th grade curriculum, but not really younger, which is interesting because does that mean we just don't have history before the kids are in 8th grade? Like, I mean, it's just kind of, that's a whole different issue. But I'd love to talk to you to see if you have anything accessible that I could present to the school and the school board to say like, this is the state of New York and this is the state of New Jersey and this is how they're changing this problem. And like, we could talk about it. And then, so that's one issue. And then the second issue is my whole background's like the whole film thing and TV. And if I had to donate more time, I would do it. But I would love to make that video for you because I grew up in New York and I remember being in elementary school and them teaching something about Native Americans at the time, that's what it was. And it was wrong. And I didn't know any better because remember I was a kid. And so I actually said something to correct it. It's the only time I ever got in trouble in school. And then they called my mother and my mother came in and then explained what was wrong. And so I wasn't in trouble anymore. But the point is, like, how old was I, like 9? Do you know what I mean? And I was correcting a teacher. But I think teachers are amazing. So it wasn't a disrespectful thing. So totally different issue. But like, it's really great that you're doing it to change it.
And just based on what you mentioned, I just wanted to add that this curriculum comes with a professional development curriculum for teachers. So this is why when we give out the resources, we actually do the professional development with the teacher because one of the intention is to make sure that the teachers have the knowledge and the resources to teach instead of just giving the resources.
So then they feel
not achieving our
confident.
goal.
That's awesome.
And the young children is real, like the pre-surveys, we didn't use any of this data today, but the pre-surveys, a lot of those teachers of young children are like, I'm not gonna teach genocide to my 3-year-olds. And I'm like, we're not gonna ask you to do that. And doing this kind of video really helps them. But you saw the quote, I think, that we pulled that was like, I only teach settler colonization to very old students, maybe graduate students. Like we have to get out, we have to get away from that. Because not, first of all, not everyone's gonna go to grad school and we should learn about settler colonialism from a young age.
And also, a land curriculum also allows teachers to be able to connect young children. Because now they're seeing their own connection. I know when we did a lot of the professional development, what a lot of the feedback that we received back was how close they were able to connect to the land and to the river. And something that is still in my mind, they were like, just in the 15 minutes that we did this, I feel that the river is something else, is an entity. I don't see it as just a river anymore. And that was teacher participating in a 70-minute professional development. So once we implement a long term, which is, you know, a month or more, we want to see what are the results for it and how teachers are coming out with it.
That's awesome. Thank you.
When it comes to really young children, I'm rewinding like 50 years back to Sesame Street. It brought like a lot of people that were different from the people I saw growing up here in Princeton, who were all very white. Is that still a thing? And has there been any indigenous representation on programming like that?
Who are the explore, yeah, Molly of Denali, sorry. Molly of Denali is great. I taught Molly of Denali in the class that they were in. It's done with an all native group of writers, and Molly of Denali takes on hard-hitting cultural appropriation and settler colonialism for the 3, 4, and 5, and 6-year-olds. So if you've got access to PBS, Molly of Denali is great. I don't know if Sesame Street is doing any indigenous representation, but Molly of Denali is just awesome.
It's done pieces, and Spirit Rangers too, is that another?
And Spirit Rangers, yeah.
Yeah. But no, I was just also just gonna add, just as a, I got comments right now. Like just thinking about sort of like land-based learning with like the really young kids and how to, you know, sort of gently introduce them or help them to reconsider these ideas, you know, these really difficult topics. I don't, like, one of the things that I do, and it's really easy to do in urban settings as well as, you know, anywhere else, is that, you know, introducing them to that, you know, to that concept of animacy. And, you know, we talk about like in our languages, how, you know, the trees and the animals and people are all, you know, like referred to with animate like pronouns. And so, you know, even just teaching the kids in English, if we're going out and like having them consider like, you know, the trees as beings and like those squirrels that they're seeing and the little birdies that they're seeing as, you know, as beings, and, you know, how that sort of shifts how they interact, how they think about how they talk to them, how they interact with them, what they think their sort of relationship is to them. And you can start to have those conversations about like hierarchy and like, you know, why this idea of like, you know, how we've created this system where, you know, we have people above animals, above plants, above, you know, the rest of the land. And within that, you know, elevating certain animals over others and elevating certain people over others. And so, you know, they can start to easily grasp some of these concepts and to like help kind of pave that way to have this conversation as to, you know, these really difficult topics about like, you know, why genocide even happens and things like that.
Just a little bit to add to that, I know what on our first unit, first lesson, we talked about the more than human. And we emphasize the more than human to center exactly, this center human for young children.
I'm gonna want to make a housekeeping announcement when we go to our coffee break. But before that, I just wanted to ask one question that follows on Rachel. I was struck by when you were talking about the development of curriculum, you have a cooperation with members of Delaware Tribe in Oklahoma at Bartlesville, and also with Ralpo Lunaapeewak, and challenging pair of collaborators to have. How did you manage the complications that arise from the differing grounds on which it's possible to engage with federally recognized in the US and state recognized communities?
We're really lucky because we're doing all this work as volunteers. And we're really lucky because we're not doing it off of a grant. And because Teachers College is just happy that we're doing the work. I know that if we were working in any kind of construct where there was money involved that was flowing to the university or what have you, but as it is, we've just been able to do small dollar funding to compensate the members of the Lenape who are doing the curriculum collaboration. I don't know if that'll get more challenging, but for right now, we're trying to stay out of the politics and just say that it's really important that people learn who they are, that they still exist, and that they are sovereign, and treaties relating to them, culture and arts, and stay away from that. I don't think it's our business as settlers to be involved in or say anything about that.
Should I come just make that little announcement? So we're gonna be having a coffee break next. I'm gonna make some coffee out of it. I just want to mention that our next session, which is going to be the public STD lecture by Mary Jane McCallum, is going to be at 4 o'clock, and it's going to be in the lecture hall where we were yesterday, where we had a formal opening and somebody did visiting. But I have to say that we're not allowed to take coffee into the lecture room. So let's have our break here, and then we can head over to that. Into the day discussion, that'll be about both looking back at these past 2 days and looking forward. We'll be able to talk more about that in coffee circles tomorrow. But maybe looking forward to last practical thing, after we finish around 5:30, we'll be back here. I want to thank the speakers.